My name is Ariane. I am one of the organizers of this beautiful conference. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight and joining us for the final talk of our conference. The last 2 days have been filled with fascinating and thought-provoking discussions made possible, of course, by our wonderful and incredible presenters. So please let's give a final round of applause for everybody who spoke over the weekend. Thank you. So if I may take another minute of your time before introducing our keynote, I just want to say that you are all invited to celebrate the end of our conference tonight with pizza, drinks, and good company, obviously. Right after this talk, we will be heading to Track and Field, located at 860 College Street West at the corner of Ossington. For those of you who want to come along, just join us, join the organizers in the big foyer right outside of this room. And for those of you who might want to join us later, we have a reservation under our organizer Talia's name. So all are welcome. But first, let's spend the next hour and a half with our special guest, Elizabeth A. Povinelli. Elizabeth A. Povinelli is Franz Boas, some would say Francine Boas, professor of anthropology and gender studies at Columbia University. She is also part of the Caribbean Film Collective, a grassroots indigenous-based media group. She is currently the Northrop Frye visiting professor here at the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto, where she is teaching a seminar on what she calls the current clash of existence and on the new possible modes of solidarity such a clash exposes or calls for. She asks, in the face of annihilation and catastrophe, with whom or what should we build ties of solidarity? Over the past 25 years, Beth's scholarly work has tackled the imaginaries on which liberal power relies. From Labor's Lot in 1994 to Geontologies in 2016, she has continued to question the constant seduction of the politics of recognition, i.e. the welcoming of an otherwise into what already exists, into what is already valued. She sees late settler liberalism as a social project with the purpose of keeping a certain arrangement in place through the governance of difference, and has thus explored different modes of governance from Australian multiculturalism in The Cunning of Recognition to geontopower in her most recent book. The competing claims of different forms of existence make these modes of governance tremble, she argues, unveiling simultaneously the contradictions and impasses of late liberalism. As her work demonstrates, these competing claims expose the tactics of late liberalism, a project which relies strongly on the demarcation between us and them, be it the marking of cultural difference or the distinction between life and non-life. Ultimately, throughout her numerous books, she develops a critique of the liberal notion of the self, as well as of the vocabulary that we, scholars in the West and elsewhere, use to support our sciences and discourses. Stressing that concepts and categorizations used to define the human, the public, or the self, for instance, are forms of discipline that confine and divide rather than describe social forms, she urges us to ask, in articulating our political projects, who and what is excluded? How does the language we use prevent us from imagining possible future arrangements? Both as a scholar and as a professor, Beth is extremely hard to delimit, or as she would put it, she is extremely hard to sack. She is hardly categorizable, embodying the very critique she has been articulating over the past 25 years about every liberal category she encounters. Reading and engaging with Beth's work as a graduate student is, at least to me, productively disconcerting and unbelievably rich experience. As academics, as you all know, we read a lot of books. But most of us will agree that there are very few books that stay with us for a long time, that strike us, and that challenge every possible corner of our minds. Geontologies did exactly that for me last year. I have rarely read a book that engages with settler colonialism, late liberalism, and unbridled capitalism in such a critical, innovative, and meaningful way. Beth's work is important because it unsettles a lot of the things even we scholars take for granted. It's not hard to picture the implications of Beth's work for the ocean and the seas, this incommensurable, mysterious other. Her keynote address tonight is both a bringing together of the various threads we've been discussing over the last 2 days and an opening towards thinking differently about the world, land, or water that surrounds us. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Elizabeth A. Povinelli.
That was super generous. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me. I'm having a great time, more generally, here in Toronto. And not only because I'm not in the US right now, though I'm sure it's part of it. But no, it's an amazing place to try and think with others who've been thinking for a very long time critically about settler colonialism, race, and the problems of liberalism. So let me start. Water and land, fresh or saltwater, desert or bog, and also, of course, air and sky. How easily we can slip into referring to and feeling as if these material spaces were actual divisions of existence that touch, that press, and that undulate against one another. As if there were material spaces in which, on which, and through which forms of life travel at their peril. The surface of the water to the depth of the land, the surface of land touching the expanse of the sky, the surface of air touching the void of space. All might seem to be different forms of a non-living medium that various forms of life can or cannot traverse without specific technical means of maintaining their form against an encroaching tide. The technical means may be foot, may be wing, gill, motor, wing, air tank. Many narratives recently touch on waterways, and more specifically, land on and sink within the surface of the vast oceans and seas. On the one hand are the initially state-backed climate sciences, tracking with ever more powerful instruments the changing patterns of tides, composition of aquatic creatures, and the formation of winds and changing weather patterns. For them, these sciences of climate change, the separations between wind and air and fresh and salt water, desert, bog, water, land, are initially, for them, these separations recede into the whole earth. From the perspective of this earth, or what many people call Gaia, all waters, lands, airs, bio and geomass co-fashion each other. They keep in place or disturb the patterns of life and non-life together. On the other hand, science and technology studies, queer science and feminist critique, and race and indigenous critique, new materialisms and ecosophies have shattered the boundaries and borders that Western epistemologies have placed on matter and which have governed all matters since. As Elizabeth Dowfrey points out, it is exactly this dual entwinement that is of the state and state power and state hegemony and critique that has given us contemporary oceanic studies. She argues that, quote, the oceanic turn of the 20th century issued from geopolitics as well as new interdisciplinary groupings in the humanities and social sciences. On the one hand, she would argue, she would date, the 1945 Truman Proclamation, which expanded U.S. hegemony over ocean waters and which inspired new extensions of U.S. sciences, including the development of the information sciences. On the other hand, was a spatial term in critical race and Marxist theory. And again, this is Elizabeth, quote, "This loosening of nationally bounded modes of thinking about capital and space led to an unprecedented number of transoceanic studies, notably the work of Marcus Rediker, which helped to inspire Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, a text that inaugurated a new generation of thinking about race in transoceanic ways," unquote. As she notes, quote, "No longer relegated to aqua nullius, the ocean is now understood in terms of its agency, its anthropogenic pollution and acidity, and its interspecies ontologies, all of which suggest that climate change is shaping new oceanic imaginaries," unquote. Tonight, I want to talk about another set of conditions that allow us to think oceans as becomings with land, becomings with air, becomings with salt and fresh, becomings with different kinds of aquatic creatures, becoming as islands sink and intertidal zones rise. Now, obviously, becomings with is Donna Haraway's phrasing, but the turn to, in now a metaphorical sense, oceanic submersions is just part, or just participates in four broad axioms of existence that have emerged, at least since what Malcolm X called the great tidal wave of color in the 1950s, and that now shape the common sense of many people in this room. The four axioms are, number one, and I don't know why I didn't put them up here. You just gotta remember. Number one, the ecstasy of existence. And I'm gonna come back to these, so don't worry. The ecstasy of existence, the distribution of the effects of power and the power to affect a given terrain of existence, the multiplicity and collapse of forms of the event, and the collapse of Western disciplines of embodied distinction and hierarchy. Those are the four. The status of these axioms varies, as we would expect, across specific disciplines and intellectual projects. Some scholars approach these axioms as if they were true, in the sense that they provide a better fit for how reality actually works than older Western epistemologies, which viewed the world as consisting of discrete subjects and objects acting in cause-effect relations with each other. Some scholars might go further, some have, and argue that these axioms, that at least the axioms in here already, 1 through 3, and I'm just going to keep repeating them, that is, the ecstasy of existence, the distribution of effects of power, the power to effect, and the multiplicity and collapse of forms of the event. Might go further and argue that axioms 1 through 3 capture how existence works in relation to itself. I myself don't care, or in a more scholarly phrasing, I am not interested so much in whether these axioms capture what is, but rather if this is what we think is true-ish, then how would our political concepts, our actions, and our way of narrating the emergence of these axioms need to change? In other words, if these axioms constitute to a greater or lesser degree the presuppositional background of current theoretical and political discourse, how are, or should, we tell the story of solidarity, concept formation, and action? Thus, all I want to do this evening is first walk through these axioms one by one, and then we'll find out walking backwards again through them. So I'm going to go one way, and then we're going to see we'll have to go the other way. Suggest what is at stake if we read the history of waterways, oceans, seas, but also what they touch and form and co-substantiate land and air through these contemporary axioms, and read these axioms themselves from the direction of the Martinique poet and theorist Edouard Glissant, namely from the direction of the history of the Middle Passage. I'm just going to leave that there. I always think I have a lot more time than I do. I don't know why. Because I start out going really slow and everything, and then I'm going to speed up, or I don't know. But anyways, I'm just going to start. Let's go with this framing. Our movement, providing direction across the seas. The first axiom, the ecstasy of existence. Like all the subsequent axioms we're going to discuss, the first axiom is not an interdisciplinary protocol that scholars sign on to as if delegates to a climate conference. Rather, they are shared spaces of intellectual maneuver and dispute. They're where we come to find out we are and are arguing about in. Not surprisingly, then, the exact vocabulary, meaning, and dynamics of the ecstasy of existence depend on whom you're reading at the time, or who you like, or who's sexy to you. In her 2007 book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, Karen Barad, for instance, argues that, quote, to be entangled is not simply to be entwined with another, as in the joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence, unquote. Jane Bennett turns to the term assemblage to note that to note the agencies that emerge when scholars begin, quote, thinking about the life-matter binary, and instead focusing on the collaboration, cooperation, and interactive interference of many bodies and forces, unquote. Donna Haraway prefers the term symbiogenesis because it stresses, quote, the ordinary is a multi-partner mud dance issuing from and in entangled species. Indeed, it's Haraway, we have to note, who has thought longest and hardest and with a capacious creativity about the making and importance of the troubling nature of what she calls oddkin for an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and post-human feminism within the Western Academy. So if we're in the Western Academy, and we're talking about the Western Academy. Across these varying scholarly projects is an insistence that neither objects nor subjects are discrete things tied together, but rather that both the tying and the thing are illusions created by dense regions of intersecting and materializing forces. The illusion of the boundary provides, and against which, within which a subject or object can be defined or is defined, can be stabilized or is stabilized, can be characterized or is characterized, and can be made into something like an autonomous entity. This doesn't mean that all Western epistemologies claim to be able to know that all of them are moving in this direction. Take, for instance, Graham Harman, who argues all objects are objects in a robust sense, that is, every object, and there are only objects, is an independent and autonomous entity with its own unique and independent essence. Now, for him, of course, all objects, including human subjects, distort their essence in relation to other objects in themselves by necessity. As a result, objects withdraw from other objects, even though through some magical quality are able to seduce other objects. I still haven't figured out why objects are just always, I don't know. Anyways, expressing their inner but elusive qualities aesthetically. Anyways, sorry, that was a diversion. The point is that this illusion of the boundary has been foundational for the Western natural sciences, and I would, in geontologies, I try and show also the scarred homology between those natural sciences and the critical sciences in the sense of knowing. This illusion has been foundation for the biological sciences, at least, relying as they have on the concept of a membrane to animate the difference between life and non-life, and to animate the difference between forms of life. This next slide. This is the greatest slide. Okay. The smallest unit of life, the cell, is defined and made possible by its membrane. The human by its skin. The species by its reproductive limits. But this boundary illusion also provides the conditions for thinking about and being able to talk about, theorize, final causes, teleology, finitude, and eventfulness, from Aristotle's acorn to Hegel's Geist to Huffington's Clash of Civilizations. Bang, you need them. But the illusion of the border, and this is important, has a material reference. That is, it's not all just smoothy smooth. The phantasmagoria has a phenomenological skid mark. No, we have to take this seriously. If we're taking, no, we do have to take it seriously. If we are not to take seriously this phenomenal referent of this illusion, we have to take, if we don't take it seriously, then either we end up with a smooth thing, that is, no difference in space, and if we over-encrust it, let's see if I can do this again, sometimes it will do it, we end up with that Western philosophy and epistemology of enclosed. We have to do something, or take seriously perhaps, something that Gregory Bateson argued in Mind and Nature. In Mind and Nature, he writes, quote, "Inside and outside are not appropriate metaphors for inclusion and exclusion in speaking of the self, or mind, or life. For him, mind is a mode of process and classification that turns back on itself when it hits information, or difference, resacking itself and to other sacks. The condition of the self is thus a process. For Bateson, mind is a verb of classification. It is a response to difference that makes a difference for the information of mind, biology, soul, life. In other words, mind is not in the sack any more than that junk is in that cell, any more than the subject is in her skin or the object ends at its crust. For him, at least, the mind, life, etc., is imminent to the sacking itself, or as I've put elsewhere, to its embagonation. Continuing bagging it. I know, that's one of my favorites. This sacking is always, of course, inside and outside itself, sacking and bagonating and banking. When we look at what appear to be objects, that is, something like, now look at those little things spurting out there. We now see the dense material ridges that forces create by disturbing or keeping other places as ridges. Embankments, then, include the sandbags or the sand dunes that keep a flood at bay as long as they can keep themselves in place as they are assaulted by the pounding and creeping waves of climate change. Embankments are mountains that contain the circulation of wind and trap pollutants until they themselves crumble under that strain. Embankments are the social identities that provide the conduits through which rights are circulated until they are twisted by these circulating rights or twisted away from them and become new forms of identity. And it is the skin that protects the inner organs unless an inner cancer eats it away, having come or begun from the outside through contamination or mutation. All these sackings of material space create the contours that are misinterpreted as autonomous insides and outsides. And this méconnaissance provides a ground for Western disciplines to differentiate themselves, biology, geology, etc., and from this initial differentiation, biology, geology, to create endless second and third and fourth order interpretations of reality. Thus, a biological difference between organic skin and rock surfaces rests on differentiating the internal potential of self-repair in the former from the lack of this potential in the latter. And this difference ramifies into subsequent ones, like the legalities of the difference between murder, possible with human subjects, killing with animal life, and destruction with inorganic objects. Without these insides or outsides, murder, killing, and destruction weave in and out of each other. And without these borders, the desecration of indigenous landscapes in Australia, that wouldn't be called desecration, they would be called murder. So if a mining company wrecks what's called the sacred site, it wouldn't be a legal instance of desecration, it would be a legal instance of murder. If a rock is qua rock, though, or soil qua soil, then from its point of view, or many humans who do not stay within these divisions, humans are merely a moment on the, quote, journey and travels of minerals, as one of my students put it. In producing us, it maintains itself. In other words, the assertion that the self-repair of life has a different status to the inert passivity of non-life allows the latter, non-life, to be treated very differently than the former, and also allows late liberalism to treat those who consider this difference not to be a difference that matters to also be treated differently. So any group that says the difference between life and non-life is irrelevant to my relationship to country can be treated under these conditions. But rocks use gravity to make sacks themselves, or gravity sacks rocks. The more, the denser the gravity is right now, I think, constant. To unsack these various formations of rocks require other sacked materials, whether the chemicals that frack shale or diamonds that tip drills for diamond drilling. That is, every tactic of self-repair, of being shattered or reinforced, leaves and absorbs tailings and trailings that circulate back into the movement and embankment of other tailings. When objects and subjects are reconceptualized in this first extant existence, entangled existence, when they're reconceptualized as areas of ongoing embankment, sacking, disembanking, embagonation, disembagonation, 2 points emerge, the first of which is that because all embankments or skinning or sackings are temporary scaffoldings that are in need of constant reinforcement and repair, they must always reach into and disturb or keep in place other regions. Or they have to find a means of limiting other regions from reaching in to them and disturbing them. To crib Michel Serres' concept of the parasite, all embankments are in an abuse relationship that is inescapable from all forms of exchange. The abuse can be a source of power. The abuse can be a source of power for an otherwise, like if you're otherwise to the system, you reach in and you try and unsack it to give yourself some embankment. It can be, obviously, the means for a hegemonic formation to stay in place. How the strainings between these spaces resolve themselves depends on how durable the materials that they are composed of are and the materials that touch them are. And here it's important to understand power as effortability and durability, the power to endure. Now this brings us to the second point about extant existence, right? Namely that the movement of embankments constantly lay down trails and give off tailings. Okay. When objects and subjects are reconceptualized as areas of ongoing embankment, sacking, and embagonation, the tails and trailings. They need constant reinforcement and repair. Where is this? Tailings are usually defined as a residue of whatever valuable material has been extracted from a mine. That's the literal. But as Catherine Youssef notes, such tailings and trailings are the irreducible, quote, substrata of the technosphere, once imagined and imaged as extraneous and external to the rational projects of materializing late modernity, but no more. Tailings may be the physics of all embankments when viewed from their indefinable crumbling and corroding edges, where tailings become political when they are the material trails that someone like Katerina Teawa follows as Bonova Island in the Pacific is gutted for the mineral phosphorus, which is crucial to the manufacturing of the fertilizer that powers the so-called green revolution. We can follow these trails as mining spews dust into the atmosphere and as winds spread the particles like settler colonizers, as airplanes spread phosphorus across previously infertile fields. As the island, Bonobo, is dispersed around the world in the form of tiny motes and big chunks of phosphorus, as it is combined and recombined with other substances, the island itself is made uninhabitable for the original residents, who in place start traveling too. But the dissipation of the island in the form of agricultural fertilizer entering the soil, plants, and human and non-human bodies, and in the form of tailings of dust entering the atmosphere, is mirrored, we could argue, by the extension of the island's sovereignty in the form of its ever vaster set of lands and landscapes, everything that all of that phosphorus went into. So that if you are from that island, you could claim anywhere that your island has extended. But equally and unavoidably, this form of chemo-sovereignty nurtures new, usually unwanted modes of existence, such as those found in and across Polynesia after the French nuclear tests and throughout Australia in vast mining districts. All of these infrastructural histories are part of the new museums of humanity. Again, as Yusuf says, waste sites, mining shafts, and extraction zones are imagined as the new museums of humanity alongside the more effectual and accumulative material registers of pollution, toxicity, and climate change. Now these embankments, and I've been talking only about embankment and tailings, like every time you embank, it's got to be kept in place. How to keep it in place? We got to take somewhere else, you will reach in, or as you reach in, it puts dust in the air, it changes biochemically things around it. And I'm talking about mainly about things that you would see maybe as material, rather than maybe, or opposed to maybe, mental processes. But long before Bateson came up with his biospheric theory of mind, William James proposed that mental concepts, and indeed all mental life, were efforts of embankment. Mental life is, and thus all concepts are, for him, or were, for him, a cacophony of, quote, efforts of attention. The source of concepts would never, therefore, be found by burrowing deeper into the mind, the abstracted mind, in search of ever more abstracted forms. Instead, if we understand concepts as forms of effort, that concepts as itself these embanked areas, James argues that we must, if we're going to see it this way, we must place mental life in the social worlds in which it exists, in which it is given dimension and qualities, and which it spreads. Concepts are not merely situated in the social world, in other words, they are the social world. They are the social world. And this is not the social world of meaning, but the social world of distributed energies and abilities to focus on the tasks at hand. That means, and it was for James, that means those whose lives are constantly shattered, disembanked, that late liberalism makes shudder constantly through class and race and settler colonialism. Part of the consequences for James is that the ability to form the concepts we need to analyze settler colonialism, capitalism, racism, which have to come from the world in which the effects of that are happening, often don't have the energy to do so. Thus, for James, we have to pay attention to the actual world and its multiplicity. We have to pay attention to the potential explanatory concepts that might provide us an account of the world in the place in which the world is most fracked and shattered. And it demands we pay attention to where these constitutive figurations are able to emerge, from who and why, and whether or not they're able to endure as much as sandbags against tides. Now at this point, we've slid fully into the second axiom. That is, if we argue that existence is entangled, then the second axiom, the distribution of the effects of power and the power to affect a given terrain of existence, I'm already talking about that, and I have been for a long time. Indeed, the political potential of the first axiom in the current crisis of global climate change and toxicity depends on the second axiom's ability to dislodge any false logical semantic equivalence arising from the first. While in general, each and every, sacking and bagination, and kind of making a space in which certain kinds of processes can happen, health, pure water, mental life. While in general, each and every one of these ways of forming space, of ridging it, providing skins, creates an inside by pulling from and leaking into an outside, and vice versa. Not every one of these processes is afforded the same amount of force to reach out and disturb other regions, or to keep at bay those trying to reach in and disturb them. In other words, what appears to be an equivalence at a semantic level, all embankments do X, Y, and Z, existence is entangled, is absolutely not equivalent from a material perspective. And this is part of what I think we really need to start focusing on. It's like the sudden shifts in when we shift from description, theoretical, and then we move that theoretical into material. Because really, we'll see at the end, it's going the other way around. The confrontation between Standing Rock Sioux trying to protect the current embankment of water and the police equipped with more than $60,000 worth of body armor, tactical equipment, and crowd control devices is not played out with equivalent forces or powers. And residents of Flint, Michigan do not have the power to roll into, oh, what's that? Sorry. I don't know what those are tailings. I know that helped you. And I'm really trying to get us to see this entangled existence, but entangled differentially protected. The residents of Flint, Michigan do not have the power to roll into the suburbs of Detroit and reroute their clean water supply, which would be one way of solving the problem. It's only when we pull the abstractions of axiom 1, entangled existence, into the differential dynamics of axiom 2 that the full implications of the politics of this first axiom come into view. It's only when we do this. And it's only with the second axiom that we can move our focus on specific political modes of materialization without creating ethical and social hierarchies of existence among subjects and objects of existence. So, and in the previous, there's that when the Standing Rock Sioux are standing there, all of what they have, including ridges, waterways, signs, clothing, horses, protests, other bodies that they mobilized against a police force with, heavily armed tanks, battered rams, whatever that kind of armor is they have. All of that is the condition of whether and who is going to be embanked and disembanked. And thus, we don't really have to pull up a hierarchy between life and non-life, forms of life, etc. Now, the third axiom, the multiplicity and collapse of forms of the event, doesn't move as seamlessly from the first two as the second did from the first. By the time you're talking about the first one in any serious way, you're already talking about the second. That is, you're saying entangled existence, and you're not all immediately talking about the differential force to affect and be affected by, then you really, whatever we're talking about doesn't matter. when we say existence is entangled. We can just become philosophers and go home. I was a philosopher. I didn't go home. So don't listen to me. Okay. So there's a really smooth, seemingly smooth move, or should be a smooth movement between the first two. That doesn't seem as smooth when you say, oh, and the third. But the effects of axiom 1 on 2 in the political imaginary of the event is truly unavoidable. The importance of the event, or its imaginary, to political theory, after all, could hardly be overestimated. As a political theorist, Ian Mackenzie notes, the central task of political theory is, quote, to debate the meaning of political events. And this central task, he argues, is always preceded by need to provide, quote, an account of political events qua events, quote. Now, the task of mastering the history of recent Western theories of the event, proposed by Rancière, Foucault, Deleuze, Badiou, Lazarato, etc., would be already kind of like enough already. But the environmentalism of the poor, the subaltern of brown and black commons have added new dimensions and modalities to these Western obsessions with the big event, the Big Bang, the catastrophe, politics as a rupture. The rupture of social time and space, felicitous and infelicitous allegiance to an event, the reorganization of the senses, the micro and molecular agencies providing the condition or impediment of the primary of an event form, the primarily discursive versus affective dimensions of the event, the virtual event, the pure event, the divine event, and the intermittent event. Across all of this, the reign of the revolutionary event, class, perhaps even in Fanon's sense, the violent destruction of the colonizer and colonized, has been supplemented, and here I mean supplemented, I'm gonna come back, but by various forms of the quasi-event, micro-events, slow death, slow violence. These quasi-events, etc., are not merely supplemental, but supplement, but they also displace this big event, catastrophic event. When we understand that the surfaces of existence and this entangled existence with these differentials of power being able to keep in place or go in and take out of place, always having to be in need of reinforcement. So there's nothing in place that isn't constantly being kept in place. And all these forms of the event are crucial to understand how the modes by which the distribution of power and the power of effect, given terraining of existence, are maintained, navigated, and interrupted. That was the whole point of the environmentalism of the poor, the argument about quasi-events and the black and brown commons, that Western theory's celebration and embrace of the event was a way of never taking ethical, political, or social responsibility for the constant crumbling of other worlds. But this third axiom argues both that the form of the event has multiplied, now we have many kinds of events, and that the event as such has collapsed. Now this collapse of the event doesn't mean that nothing ever happens, or the more things change, the more they remain the same. Rather, in the shadow of the first and second axioms, tangled existence, differential powers, events don't merely shrink. Events are displaced by unevenly distributed and dispersed uneventful happenings across these terrains. In repetition and difference, for instance, Deleuze argued that any encounter creates intensities. And he argues that these intensities may rise to the threshold, to the level of a threshold, what he called a threshold event. A moment when an intensity creates a phase transition, which is what people are worried about the oceans. But most intensities that radiate from an encounter, or I think in the language of the sacking and resacking, everything's entangled, everything's caught up in everything, rather than an encounter. So an encounter is like bang, are so small, low, or slow that no transition ever occurs. But whether these kinds of intensities give rise to a qualitative shift in materiality or not, these pullings that are not encounters, these distributing $60,000 so some people won't be touched when other people are radically beaten back, do something. They might not make an event, small or large, but they do something. They disclose something. And these doings and disclosures are themselves unpredictable and unknowable. So we know some things, but of course we're never going to know everything. Hannah Arendt's understanding of action gives us a hint of the kinds of actions without events at stake here. The consequences of action is boundless because action, though it may proceed from nowhere, so to speak, acts into a medium where every reaction becomes a chain reaction and where every process is the cause of new processes. Perhaps counterintuitively, nothing happens in these forms in which the event collapses in the sense of no phase transition occurring as part of the boundless, unpredictable nature of action. That a region of existence can't seem to dislodge what is sucking it dry, right? And here, at the moment, we have Black Lives Matter with incredible force trying to re-embank modes of Black lives. And we still have primarily white policemen shooting African Americans in the back with no consequences. Even when a region of existence, in this sense human existence, in all of its material extensions, can't seem to dislodge what is sucking its dry, that no matter what they try to do, nothing seems to be happening. Nevertheless, in keeping an intensity forward, something